What is it about America, the America under the Trump presidency, that makes it no longer resemble the America that we all thought we once knew? Remember the American dream? Remember the land of opportunity? Remember the streets paved in gold? Remember the great democracy with social diversity, cultural diversity, tolerance? Remember the country that once thought it could exert moral leadership on a world scale? Did that America ever really even exist? And more importantly, looking well beyond the Trump presidency into the future, 1 or 2 generations from now, 10 to 20 years from now, what will be the long-lasting effects of the Trump phenomenon on the social fabric of America and on America's place in the wider world long after he's gone? These are some of the big questions that I want to try to tackle today. But first, I want to make very clear, this is not a political talk. I'm not offering you a political science analysis. This is a piece of social anthropology. I'm going to try to briefly take a look at where America came from, where we are today, where we were even before Trump was elected, and then we'll take a look at where we're going. And I want to start by telling you about a woman I met in Louisiana, a single mother, 24 years old. Her name was Nita Fisher. I was traveling in 2016 across 16 states, traveling across America, interviewing lots of ordinary Americans, victims of gun violence, victims of racism. I was looking at poverty. I was looking at different issues for a book I was writing at the time, set against the backdrop of the 2016 presidential election. In this small town in Louisiana, near the Texas border, oil and gas country, Nita Fisher, a 24-year-old worker at a Walmart supermarket, told me her story. Nita Fisher had worked at Walmart. She was very proud of her job. She was earning $9 an hour, just a little bit above the minimum wage. She was working in the deli counter at a supermarket. And she was 6 months pregnant when she fell and hurt herself. She was taken to hospital. She was taken to doctors. And 2 days later, when the doctors had made sure that her baby was not damaged, she returned to work with the doctor's certificates. Well, her manager at Walmart called her in and said, "I'm sorry, you're fired." And she said, "But I have my doctor's notes." "Sorry, Walmart doesn't accept medical certificates." Now, for those who don't know, Walmart is perhaps the quintessence of American exploitative capitalism, a company with $500 billion of revenues and 2 million employees, and perhaps the most harshly criticized company in America when it comes to workers' rights. But Nita Fisher, who I met in this tiny, tiny hovel of a hut near the train tracks in a Louisiana town, she was now below the poverty line. She'd been told she could reapply for her job, come back and work at another Walmart, starting at the $7.25 an hour minimum wage, and that would be fine. She had her baby, she went back to Walmart, and she fell below the poverty line. And today she's unable to feed that child without welfare and food stamps because she's not earning enough in her salary. Like many Americans, like perhaps 100 million Americans, she has a McJob, a service industry job that pays the minimum wage and doesn't allow those Americans to live in a dignified manner. But as I talked to her, I asked her about other issues. I asked her about gun control. She pulled a pistol, a loaded gun, from underneath the small couch in this tiny room and said, "I've got my gun here. We're going to protect the Second Amendment. If a robber comes, I'll shoot him dead, call the cops, and have them take away the body." I asked her about Obama, who was still president at the time. She called him, well, she used a racial epithet, a racist epithet against the president at the time. And then I asked her who she'd be voting for, and she said she would be voting for Donald Trump. And I asked her why, and she said because he would get rid of the scroungers, the freelooters, the poor people who were trying to take money from hardworking Americans like her. She didn't look up at the 1% or at the billionaires or at Wall Street. She looked down at those who were even worse off than her. But if Nita Fisher was part of the base that elected Donald Trump, it's worth pointing out that 52% of all college-educated women in America voted for Trump. And the Trump phenomenon and its impact on American culture, mores, values, and society is a far more profound cultural revolution with a basic redirection of our most basic values. And that is something that should give us all cause for reflection. Because in that America, we are not valuing the democratic institutions of our history. Today, the most basic American values are under siege. The democratic institutions are under siege. The checks and balances of a system that used to have checks and balances between the executive branch, the Congress, and the judiciary are under threat, under fire. The independence of the American judiciary system, of judges and courts, is assailed almost every day from the White House. The FBI, the Justice Department, the most basic institutions are under threat. And at the same time, the freedom of the press is under assault. The President of the United States calls real news fake news and has created a counterculture of a series of statements, of falsehoods that emanate in daily tweets that are reminiscent of the big lie under Hitler's time that propaganda minister to Hitler perfected, Joseph Goebbels. He once said, "Tell a big lie often enough and people will believe it." So with this kind of situation in American society, where are we going and what's happening? Well, the rights that we thought were established for half a century or more, women's rights, the rights of minorities, the rights of immigrants, the rights of blacks, the rights of gays, all are under fire, all are under siege right now. So how did we get here? What's really been driving all of this? Well, if we look back, perhaps not 1 or 2 years, but 30 or 40 years, we discover that the American welfare system, all the social shock absorbers that were put in place after the Great Depression in the last century are today basically dismantled. But it began with Reagan in the 80s, who cut welfare. It continued under Bill Clinton, who in the 90s promised to end modern welfare as we know it. And it continued during 8 years of George W. Bush. These cuts to welfare, down to the bone, came before Trump. What Trump is doing right now, we could call the coup de grâce to the rest of the welfare state. At the same time, the other element of this Molotov cocktail of societal damage, the increase in poverty, the decline in welfare, the gun violence that's happening, is of course racism in America. As I went around America talking to many Afro-American leaders, victims of the massacres at the Charleston Mother Emanuel African Episcopal Church, and other leaders who had lived since the 60s, since the civil rights legislation that ended segregation in America 50 years ago, I learned that for many of these black leaders, what had changed was not racism, which they told me had always been just below the surface of American culture and society. And what had happened and what had changed, as Trump refused to disavow the Ku Klux Klan and made remarks about Charlottesville, the neo-Nazis at Charlottesville being some very fine people, what had happened is that Trump had ripped the Band-Aid off racism, had made it acceptable for those poor whites and others, and not just in the South, to express themselves in a more racist manner. If you constantly demean and attack immigrants, Muslims, Mexicans, Hispanics, and all sorts of minorities, you're going to encourage that. And it is no coincidence that since the election in November 2016, hate crimes, violent crimes, race crimes have increased by 400% in America. Add to this Molotov cocktail of poverty, racism, the problem of gun violence. We've seen in recent days what happened in a Florida school, the gun massacres, the power of the NRA, the American gun lobby. But we've also seen a tiny sign of hope, a group of high school students in Florida who in America become the conscience of the nation, a group of kids having the courage to stand up to the gun lobby. Will it make a big difference in the end? I don't think so. There are 320 million Americans and 350 million guns in circulation in America. There's too much of the gun culture and the cowboy culture embedded in the American psyche for it to end. Even the ban on assault rifles is unlikely to become complete anytime soon. So this is the situation domestically. Internationally, we have the rhetoric emanating from the White House that seems to have far more in common with dictatorships, authoritarian regimes and despots than with the traditions of moral rectitude of American presidents, at least in modern American history. And we have a situation where the President of the United States praises and seems to like dictators like Erdogan in Turkey, Duterte in the Philippines. Just yesterday, the President, half-jokingly one would hope, praised and congratulated the President of China for eliminating all term limits and allowing himself to become, as Trump put it, President for life. Congratulations to the President of China, he said. We ought to try that here in Washington. I wish I were exaggerating. I wish I was being extreme. I wish I was saying these things just to be provocative. But unfortunately, I believe that this is a mechanical process in America, in American culture and society, that is currently underway and is likely to lead to long-lasting damage. Long-lasting damage which can affect the health and the lives of millions of people. Today, there are 43 million Americans under the poverty line, but there are 100 million Americans close to the poverty line. That's 1/3 of our population. Today, we face a situation where the mechanics of this change are being affected through the court appointments by the President. Let me take a moment to explain that. In America, the appointment of a Supreme Court justice, as Trump had one, and he's likely to have another one, at least, giving him a clear majority of conservative justices, they can determine a woman's right to choose. They can make abortion illegal. They can discriminate against minorities through court rulings. And beyond the Supreme Court, there are hundreds of federal and other judges that are appointed by the government that are being appointed right now with very few qualifications and with a kind of right-wing agenda, anti-abortion, anti-minority, voter suppression agenda, that is likely to influence court judgments and the rule of law across America, not for 1 or 2 years, but for a generation or two, for 10 or 20 years, for a long time. That's lasting damage over time. That is the mechanical way that the courts will affect American society and shape American values in the future. That cannot be changed easily because these court appointments last for a long time. But even more alarming to me is the way our culture is being changed. The basic decency, the basic notion of cultural diversity doesn't exist in half of America today. Basically, today, America is divided between those who still want to preserve American values and those who are happy to see the rights of women curtailed, the rights of gays curtailed, the rights of blacks and other minorities curtailed. That is where we are going in the United States of America in society today, and that is a great fear for me and for all right-thinking, honest people. Is there something positive I can say about the Trump phenomenon? Is there some good news coming out of this? Well, one, yes, it's good that high school students in Florida, victims of a gun shooting, have become the conscience of a nation. It is good that finally someone is standing up to the gun lobby. Will that resolve issues? I don't think so. Does it give hope for the future? A little bit, yes. Is there hope on climate change? No, not for a nation that pulls out of a global climate agreement. Is there hope for Middle East peace? No, not for a nation that makes terrible mistakes and allows Putin to rewrite the geopolitical map of Syria and the Middle East by doing nothing. Is there hope for world trade? Not in the short term. If the President of the United States announces that he likes trade wars, wants to attack Europe and China and the rest of the world on trade and protectionism. There is good news for Wall Street. There is good news for American economic growth over the next 24 months, maybe 36 months. Why? Because those huge tax cuts that Trump got through the Congress a few months ago will benefit American economic growth. It will grow by half a percentage point more over the next 2 or 3 years in the short term. But of course, later on, as happened in the Reagan years, we'll all end up paying the bill either through a new financial crisis or through an American debt crisis that explodes and damages the world economy 5, 6, 7, 8 years from now. That's the way it went in the 80s. That's the way most of my friends at the Federal Reserve believe it will go under Trump. Short-term gain, long-term pain. You know, I really, today, apart from being honored to be here at Oxford, I wanted to be able to end my talk with some kind of an uplifting message, with something that would allow us to have hope and look forward. And of course, I thought about the fact that America is a resilient country. America is a big country. There is a resistance. There are at least half of the Americans, maybe more, who don't want to see this destruction of basic American values. But on the other hand, if the situation continues, and I think it will, whether Trump is impeached, whether Mr. Mueller continues and succeeds with his valiant attempt to bring people to justice or not, whether Trump is elected and re-elected in 2020 or not for another 4-year term, and it is possible, not out of the question at all, that notwithstanding everything he will be. If all of that happens, it still may not change the fact that there is lasting structural damage to our society that will result from this current phase in our history. You see, if you, on a daily basis, attack, demean, demonize, delegitimize the most basic values and institutions of a democracy, then in the long term, that will be a big problem. And I fear the future, at least over the next 20 years, irrespective of how long Trump remains in office, the die is cast, and the future could be that America becomes a much darker place. Thank you.